shootout. In this case, of course, the animals represent people. And what do you think this story is about? Well, it's about motivation. It reminds us that if we're not moving forward, we're falling behind. And the results can be disastrous. This is another very famous story. It's from the famous I Have a Dream speech of Martin Luther King. And he said, "I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at a table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." So what's working here? Certainly the vivid imagery, there's no question about that. King uses words that conjure up specific places and specific people. It's the red hills of Georgia, not just the South. He talks about the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners. He could have just said people. He says, my 4 children, rather than just children. The vivid imagery gives you the sense that King can actually see this dream, that he's actually had this dream, and somehow that makes it more real and more possible. There are actual characters in this dream, and there's certainly a sense of time unfolding. In fact, it's looking to the future, and many stories do that. And once again, there's a very clear motivational message here. Here's how one psychologist described the power of story for human beings. She said stories are the pathway to engaging our right brain and triggering our imagination. By engaging our imagination, we become participants in the narrative. We can step out of our own shoes, see differently, and increase our empathy for others. Through imagination, we tap into creativity that is the foundation of innovation, self-discovery, and change. So I think what the psychologist is saying here is that basically human beings are hardwired to connect to stories, to understand stories, to learn from stories. Stories can get across very complex ideas very, very simply. So here's one that's often used to convey the impact of climate change. And what people say is if a frog is placed in a pan full of boiling water, it will leap out to safety. But if it is placed in cold water that is gradually warmed and brought to a boil, the frog will doze contentedly until it is cooked to death. And the idea of this is that you don't really understand change that's happening slowly and therefore can be lulled into a false sense of security. I should add that scientists don't actually think that this is the way that frogs would behave, but I guess it would be pretty cruel to run the experiment. But it doesn't really matter. Whether the story is true or not is extremely effective. Why are stories important in fundraising communication? Because they have the power to motivate. They can change attitudes and ultimately they can change behavior. Stories also give a human face to organizations. So going back to that idea that we're hardwired to connect with stories, hardwired to connect with humans, donors probably don't support organizations. They probably support people who are helped by those organizations. We hear there's stories of people who need help and we want to help them. So it's not a faceless organization, it's an individual whose experiences mean something to us. Stories help to build that trust and credibility. A story can be as simple as a quotation. If you want to build a ship, don't drum up people to collect wood and don't assign them tasks and work, but rather teach them to long for the endless immensity of the sea. Not only is this a good example of how you can create a story in basically it's one sentence, but it's also kind of a great fundraising event. It's kind of, if I was going to paraphrase it for a fundraiser, I'd say, don't tell people about the cash your food bank needs to buy a refrigerator. Let them dream of a world where all children have wholesome, delicious food to eat. So what makes a good story? Well, here's an example that I think is kind of interesting. My partner was working with a professor writing about his research on a topic that's fairly esoteric. He was talking about the difference between performance goals and learning goals. And yeah, we really didn't know what that meant either. But Max asked him for an example, and this is the example he gave. He told the story of this forest fighter, Warren Dodge. A number of men under Dodge's command were dropped into the mountains of Montana to put out a fire. The fire turned on them and threatened to overtake them. Dodge lit an escape fire and told the others to join him in the middle of the burned area. Instead, they decided to run for their lives. The fire passed by Dodge, who survived, but soon engulfed the rest. So it's a pretty powerful story. It kind of captures, and as it happens, it captures exactly what the professor wanted to say about the difference between performance and learning goals. So some of the crucial elements of storytelling and fundraising from my perspective, first of all, a story has to have characters. Real stories always trump fictional stories, although made-up stories can work. Names are important, whether fictional or true. So you should always give your characters a name and a little bit of personality if you can. As we've said, stories have a certain drama to them, something that happens. A beginning, something that happens, and an end. Of course, a story in fundraising or in any kind of corporate communication has to relate to the message that's being conveyed. So it's not just any story; it's a story that can teach us something about what we're talking, about the ask that we're making. And of course, stories are an opportunity to really pull at the heartstrings. So when we talk about some of the problems that people face, that's going to create an emotional connection between the donor and the organization. And yet, they also have to appeal to the brain. They have to give the facts, the information. There's been a long-standing debate about whether the most effective stories are positive or negative. So by negative, I mean the kinds of stories that warn kids about drinking and driving by showing them scenes of car accidents and the kinds of results that can come from that sort of behavior. I tend to believe that positive stories are more motivating in fundraising because they can illustrate the impact of giving to donors. But negative stories also have their place. They can help people learn from others' mistakes, and even in fundraising they can be effective. So how do you create a story? I hope I've persuaded you that fundraising communication should have stories in it. How do you go about doing that? Well, the first thing to do is to identify the stories that your organization has and can offer. And you'll find that as you start asking around, people know where the good stories are. Then you have to figure out how to tell it best. And stories are about humans, and they must have human voices in them. And that generally means interviewing. Sometimes we feel a little reluctant to interview, but it's that immediacy, that freshness that comes from hearing the story directly from the person who lived it that gives stories their life and their authenticity. You may not have interviewing skills at the moment, or you may not feel that you do, but there's something we're going to come back to actually in Module 6, and we'll talk a little bit more about how to interview and what you can do to prepare. So that's the module on storytelling. It's time to do your exercise. And in this exercise, I'm going to ask you to tell me your story. So in 400 words or less, I want you to tell me a story about how your career in fundraising has developed, either how you got into it, who influenced you, how you discovered your true talents, why you became passionately engaged with the organization that you represent. Your story should have interesting characters and a sense of drama and a clear message for other people who may be considering this career. So don't forget the motivational aspect of this. This exercise actually serves two purposes, because it's probably important as a fundraiser to have a personal story to tell. So to think about why you're doing what you're doing. Often this can be a way to connect with donors on a one-on-one basis as well. If you can share your story, you can often encourage people to share theirs and to connect with you on a human basis. So there's kind of two purposes here. Good luck with your story. I'll look forward to reading it.